The arrow did not just wound a king, it pierced the last illusion of Viking invincibility. In the chaos of medieval war, as steel clashed and men shouted beneath grey skies, Harald Hardrada stood exactly where every great leader stands, at the front. Then came the impact. Blood spread across chainmail, and in that moment, the age of the Vikings began to collapse. History rarely announces its turning points, but sometimes it screams. Hardrada was not just another raider chasing silver across foreign shores. He was a hardened architect of war, forged in Byzantine campaigns and northern battles long before England ever felt his shadow. By 1066, he carried more experience than most medieval kings combined. The Vikings followed him not out of fear but belief. They believed he could not lose. And that belief, almost always, is where great downfalls begin. When he stepped onto English soil, this was not a raid fueled by impulse. This was calculated conquest. Ships anchored with purpose, warriors positioned with discipline. Blood had already been spilled at Fulford, and victory seemed almost inevitable. But here is where seasoned leaders often make their most subtle mistake. Confidence begins to whisper that the next fight will be easier. And that whisper, in the brutal logic of war, is often the most dangerous sound of all. Long before England, long before that final arrow and the blood that marked the end of an era, Harald Hardrada had already survived more war than most medieval rulers would ever see. As a teenager, he fought at the Battle of Stiklestad, where his half-brother, King Olaf, was killed. Most young warriors would have been crushed by that kind of defeat. Hardrada did something different. He left, not in retreat, but in preparation. And that decision alone tells you what kind of man the Vikings were following. Exile sent him east, into the courts of Kievan Rus, and eventually south to Constantinople. There, inside the Byzantine Empire, he joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit made up largely of Norse warriors. This was not chaotic raiding. This was structured medieval war at the highest level. Urban sieges, naval operations, political assassinations. Hardrada did not just swing an axe. He learned strategy. He learned discipline. He learned how empires think and how they fall. Years passed, and with them came wealth, scars, and reputation. He returned north not as a reckless Viking, but as something far more dangerous. A commander who understood both the savage edge of Vikings and the machinery of organized medieval power. That combination is rare, and when rare men begin to believe destiny owes them something, history tends to shift. England would soon become more than ambition. It would become a claim. And claims, as any student of war knows, demand to be tested. When Hardrada set sail for England in 1066, this was not a desperate gamble. It was a calculated move in a much larger medieval power struggle. England had just lost its king, Edward the Confessor, and the throne was suddenly uncertain. In moments like that, Vikings do not see chaos. They see opportunity. Hardrada claimed that he had a legitimate right to rule, and in the brutal logic of war, a claim backed by ships and steel becomes very persuasive. Nearly 300 longships cut across the North Sea. Thousands of seasoned warriors followed him. Not farmers with axes, but men shaped by decades of blood and conflict. When they landed in northern England, they did not creep ashore. They advanced. The first major clash came at the Battle of Fulford, where the English Earls Edwin and Morcar attempted to stop the invasion. The result was decisive. The English lines broke. The Vikings stood victorious. It felt inevitable. Victory does something subtle to an army. It relaxes the edges. After Fulford, Hardrada expected negotiation, perhaps surrender. Why wouldn't he? He had just demonstrated overwhelming force. So when he marched toward Stamford Bridge, many of his men left parts of their armor behind. The day was warm. The resistance seemed broken. But medieval war has a cruel sense of timing, because while the Vikings rested, another army was already moving. Faster than anyone thought possible. While the Vikings believed the north had been secured, King Harold Godwinson was doing something almost unthinkable. He had just defended the southern coast of England against a possible Norman invasion. His army was exhausted, supplies were limited, and yet, instead of resting, he marched north, nearly 200 miles in a matter of days. In medieval war, speed was rarely this decisive, But this was not a slow campaign. This was a calculated gamble, fueled by urgency. Godwinson understood something crucial. If he allowed Hardrada to consolidate power, the Vikings would dig in. Reinforcements would arrive. The invasion would transform into occupation, so he moved with ruthless efficiency. The English army advanced quietly, covering distance at a pace that caught even seasoned commanders off guard. This was not brute force, this was timing. And in war, timing can be sharper than any blade. On September 25, 1066, the English army appeared at Stamford Bridge. Hardrada was not expecting a full-scale assault that day. Many of his warriors were lightly armored. Some were still positioned away from the main force. What had felt like controlled dominance only days earlier now shifted into confusion. And confusion, in the opening seconds of battle, spreads faster than blood. The clash that followed would not be gradual. It would be sudden, violent, and deeply personal. The first clash did not begin with a full army charge. It began at a narrow crossing, Stamford Bridge itself. According to later accounts, a single Viking warrior held the bridge against the advancing English forces, cutting down men as they tried to cross. Whether the story grew in the retelling or not, it captures something real about medieval war. Moments of individual defiance can briefly hold back the tide of history, but only briefly. Eventually, the English adapted. A soldier reportedly drifted beneath the bridge and struck upward with a spear, ending the stand. And just like that, the pathway opened. What followed was not elegant maneuvering or grand formations. It was brutal, close combat. Shields collided. Axes split through helmets. Blood soaked into the earth that days earlier had felt calm and secure. The Vikings, many without full armor, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival rather than conquest. Hardrada stepped forward as commanders must when chaos spreads. He did not retreat behind his men, he advanced. Witnesses described him fighting without chainmail, driven by urgency rather than protection. In moments like that, leadership becomes visible and vulnerable. And then, in the middle of the melee, the arrow came. It struck his throat. No dramatic speech, no final rally, just impact and collapse. But the battle was not over yet, because even after a king falls, armies do not immediately surrender. When Harald Hardrada fell, the Viking army did not immediately collapse. That's importante entender. In medieval war, momentum does not shift in silence. It fractures slowly, then all at once. For a few crucial minutes, the Vikings fought with desperate intensity. Leaders shouted commands, shields locked tighter, blood mixed with mud beneath their boots. But something invisible had already changed. The certainty was gone. Without Hardrada's presence anchoring the line, coordination began to weaken. Reinforcements under Eystein Ora arrived running from their ships, exhausted from the sudden march. They entered the fight already winded, already strained. And fatigue in war is not a minor inconvenience. It is lethal. The English pressed forward methodically. This was no reckless charge. It was pressure, relentless, disciplined pressure. The Viking shield wall, once a symbol of northern dominance, started to splinter. Gaps opened. Individual fights replaced collective defense. And in medieval battle, once cohesion breaks, recovery is nearly impossible. Men who had crossed the sea with dreams of conquest were now fighting simply to stay alive. The ground near Stamford Bridge became thick with bodies, weapons, and shattered ambition. By the end of the day, the Viking army was no longer an invading force. It was a retreating remnant. And that retreat carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. The retreat from Stamford Bridge was not just tactical. It was symbolic. Of the nearly 300 longships that had carried the Vikings to England, only a fraction were needed to bring the survivors home. That detail alone tells you everything. This was not a setback that could be quickly repaired. It was structural. The blood spilled that day did not just weaken an army. It weakened a tradition of conquest that had shaped medieval Europe for nearly 3 centuries. For generations, the word Vikings had inspired fear across coasts and kingdoms. Monasteries burned. Cities paid tribute. Armies hesitated at the sight of longships on the horizon. But Stamford Bridge exposed a shift in balance. England was no longer vulnerable in the same way. Its leadership responded with speed, coordination, and strategic clarity. Medieval war was evolving. Centralized kingdoms were becoming more organized, more responsive. The era of surprise coastal dominance was closing. And here's the deeper layer most people miss. Hardrada's fall did not just weaken Norway's ambitions, it reshaped England's immediate future. Because only days after defeating the Vikings in the north, King Harald Godwinson would be forced to march south again. Another invasion was already underway. Another army had landed, and this time the outcome would define England for centuries. Stamford Bridge ended the Viking Age, but it also set the stage for something even more transformative. Harald Godwinson stood victorious at Stamford Bridge, but victory in medieval war is rarely pure. The field was his. The Vikings were broken. Hardrada lay dead. Yet the English army had paid a price that does not always show itself immediately. They had marched north at a punishing pace. They had fought a brutal close-quarters battle, and they had emptied themselves to secure the realm. There is a quiet truth about war that seasoned commanders understand. Exhaustion lingers longer than celebration. Godwinson's men were not fresh recruits. They were hardened fighters who had just endured forced marches and relentless combat. Armor grows heavier after battle. Shields feel thicker. Even confidence carries weight. And in 1066, weight would matter. Because while the blood of Vikings was still drying in the north, sails appeared in the south. William of Normandy had landed. Another army, another claim, another war waiting to be fought. And the king who had just ended the Viking Age now faced a second storm, with far less strength than he had before. Harald Hardrada's death did more than remove a rival from England's throne. It closed a chapter that had defined medieval Europe for centuries. The Vikings had once moved like a force of nature, unpredictable, mobile, relentless. They reshaped coastlines, economies, kingdoms. Their longships were symbols of fear and opportunity. But at Stamford Bridge, that rhythm broke. Not because the Vikings had suddenly become weak, but because Europe had changed. Kingdoms were more organized, response times were faster, armies were more disciplined. The chaos that once gave northern warriors their edge no longer guaranteed dominance. Medieval war was evolving, and the old model of expansion was losing ground. When Hardrada fell, something symbolic ended with him. He was not a minor raider. He was the last great embodiment of that earlier world, forged in distant campaigns, driven by ambition, sustained by belief in destiny, claimed through force. After him, no Viking king would again launch an invasion of England on that scale. The era that began with sudden coastal terror had concluded in a field of mud and blood, and history, as it always does, moved forward, leaving legends behind.